My childhood was normal, like most of yours. I loved Disney movies and hanging out with my grandma because she always had candy. And I was a mama's boy who thought he should have been born a girl. My mother and I argued about it a lot, starting at a very young age. I would tell her I was a girl, and she would tell me that I wasn't. And I would tell her that I wanted to be, and she would tell me that it would pass. Starting when I was 11 or 12, I started asking my mother every couple of months, "What would you do if one of your kids was gay?" And she always had the same answer. "I would still love them, but none of my kids is." I don't know if it was her drinking or her drug use or her lapsed Catholicism that gave her the amount of denial she needed for it to not click, but you would think for absolutely anybody else it would have clicked. Around this same time, I started drinking and drugging with the older kids because I couldn't deal with the chaos in my home, and I couldn't deal with the chaos inside myself around my own gender and sexuality. When I was 14, I came into the apartment, and to the right, the neighbor girl was sitting on our couch talking on the phone with a friend from school, and to the left, my mother was sitting at the dining room table smoking a cigarette, as she normally was. The neighbor said that her friend wanted to talk to me, and I was confused, but I obliged. After a few minutes, I gave the phone back to my neighbor, and she bust out into laughter. I looked at her, and I said, "What's so funny?" A look of fear came over her face, and she was silent. So I prompted again, "What's so funny?" And she said, "My friend says you sound gay." And in a moment, I just responded, "Well, tell her that's because I am." But from behind me, my mother argued, "No, you're not." And I looked to her and I said, "Mom, I'm gay." And she said, "No, you're not." And I said, "Yes, I am." And she yelled, "No, you're not." And I screamed, "Mom, I'm a fucking faggot." And I slammed out of the apartment door. The next year, when I was 15, my mother went on vacation to meet a man she had met in an AOL chat room. 2 weeks later, and 2 days after she was supposed to be back, my mother told me by phone that she wasn't coming home and that they were comfortable together and there was not going to be a space for me with them. I was 15 years old, and now I was living alone in this apartment that I had shared with my mother. And I was angry and I was sad, but most of all, I was just really confused at what I had done wrong. I stayed drunk and high a lot the next 6 months because I didn't want to feel any of the feelings that were coming up, and I had no tools to deal with any of it anyways. And I did what I had to make ends meet, and then just before my 16th birthday, my aunt and uncle would fly me from where I was living in Arizona across the country to live with them in Northern Virginia. When I was 17, I got my driver's license, and shortly after that, I got a call from my mother's boyfriend telling me that my mother had been in a coma for 2 weeks, and it wasn't looking good, and I better'd come. I was terrified of seeing my mother in a coma, and I was terrified of losing her. Regardless of all the drama, I wasn't ready to say goodbye to her. I drove up to Pennsylvania in my uncle's truck, and I was terrified as a new driver, and I was terrified to see my mother in the hospital, but I knew I had to get there. And as I arrived to the hospital, I couldn't handle all the things going on in the hospital room, so I became hyper-focused on the fact that my mother's lips were chapped and cracked and bleeding, and why the fuck wasn't anyone in this hospital taking care of my mother? So I applied and I reapplied Vaseline because it was the one thing that I could do, and I just continued to apply and reapply Vaseline for a few hours. I took a break from the room, and then a couple hours later, I went back into her hospital room, and again, I was applying Vaseline to her lips when, out of nowhere, my mother's eyes opened. And she looked up to me and, in a soft but rough voice, said, "Pat, are you still gay?" 17 days in a coma, and the very first words out of her mouth were, "Are you still gay?" Our relationship was very much on again, off again over the next 2 years, and mostly by phone. And I went away to college, and I still had no way to deal with all this chaos inside me, with my own gender and sexuality, with the drama with my family, with all the dysfunction. I had no way to deal with it, so I went back to what I was used to, and I began drinking and drugging just like I had in my early teens. And when I was 24 years old, I crashed my car over the side of the road, and to this day, I still don't remember that accident. But when I woke up the next day and found out what had happened, I knew I couldn't drink safely again. But I also knew my mother, and She had tried and failed to get sober numerous times, and I was her offspring. How was it going to be any different for me? If she couldn't get sober, how was I supposed to? About a year later, I called my mother, and as part of my work in recovery, I was making amends to her, and that part went pretty well, but then she attempted to half-ass an amends to me, during which she said, "I'm so glad I sent you to live with your aunt and uncle." And I cut her off and I said, "You didn't send me to live with them, you left, and I've got to go." And I hung up the phone and I had an emotional breakdown. About a year later, I was on the phone with my mother again, and I told her that I wanted to have a relationship and I was willing to try, but our relationship had to be free from lies and free from deceit and free from manipulation, and she stopped calling as much. And to be completely honest, I stopped answering even when she did, because as much as I wanted to have a good relationship with my mother, I was really trying to get well, and I didn't know how to do both at the same time. When I was 28 years old, my oldest brother called me to tell me that my mother had gone into hospice. When I got off the phone, I cried so hard that I literally thought I was going to pass out, because much as I tried, I could not catch my breath. That night, I called her nurse, who told me that my mother was unresponsive and they didn't expect her to last more than a few days. And when I got off the phone, I had no idea what to do. I was lost. I still wasn't ready to say goodbye, regardless of everything that had happened, because we still had so much left unresolved. The next day, I called her nurse again, and her nurse told me that my mother had woken up and her system seemed to be doing better, and now the doctors were saying that she might have a couple months to live, and that I could talk to her. And I talked with her, and to my surprise, one of the first questions she asked me was, "Do you have a boyfriend?" I was shocked. But I told her about Grant, the guy that I was living with at the time, and I told her about my dog, who I had named Stevie Nicks after her favorite musician, because it was my way to be connected to her when I couldn't be connected to her. And then she told me she wasn't feeling well and she had to go. I got off the phone and I talked to some friends because I didn't know what to do, but by the end of the night, I had booked a trip to go see her that weekend in Fargo, North Dakota, where she was living at the time. And the next day, I called my mother and I told her I was coming to see her, and she said, "Pat, I haven't seen you in 10 years. And I said, "I know." And then she asked me if I had a boyfriend. She had completely forgotten the conversation we had the day before, so we had it over again, and it ended the same way, with her saying she wasn't feeling well and she had to go. The next day, I called my mother again, and the phone rang and there was no answer, and I had this sinking feeling inside my stomach. A couple hours later, my oldest brother called me and confirmed my fears that my mother had passed away, and I got off the phone and I just cried. I knew that I still had to go, because part of me wanted to do it to honor her, and part of me knew that I needed to find closure, and part of me hoped that by clearing out her apartment, I might find some answers as to why things had gone the way they had in my childhood. When I got off the plane that weekend in Fargo, North Dakota, I went directly to the funeral home. I walked into the room alone, and I stood by the door, and all these thoughts swirled around in my head, screaming of all these things I had told myself for years that I would say to my mother when she was dead, when it would no longer hurt her, about how she had fucked up my childhood and fucked me up and completely ruined my life. And I walked across the room, and I grabbed her hand, and the only words that came out of my mouth were, "I wish things had been different for you. I wish things had been different for me, and I wish things had been different for us."